I think it's really interesting when you just look at the history of it and you start to connect them to real people. And you're like, this is what this real person taught. And we know what Jesus taught. And then we know who Gamilel is, but we don't know that much. And then you look at what Paul then taught, and then what did it mean for him to be a Jew of Jews? And then what did it mean for him to have this knowledge?
There's a lot of cross-cultural pollination going on between Judaism and the Greek world for a long time. But Paul did come from a school of Judaism that was more easily synthesized with the teachings of Christ than others.
So Paul being trained by, do you say Gamilel or Gamilel?
Whichever
one you want for the day. So I'll say Gamilel just so we have both. So he was the grandson of Hillel.
Yeah.
And so his school,
super conservative,
but also like the most lenient in a way.
Oh, more grace based.
And so like Hillel and Shammai. So like you have like at that same time period, which were Hillel was almost a contemporary of Jesus. Like he died like right before Jesus or right around that time. They're not sure if Jesus ever interacted with him when he was young or something potentially. But I think it's really interesting because that's just thinking about the history of it and the Jewish faith at the time and what was going on and where Paul came from and what Jesus was doing and what Jesus was speaking into. So like you have this historically, you have, let's say, the last 300 years of spiritual leadership of the Jews in the hands of 5 successions of pairs of religious teachers. And one of those is the Nasi, who's the president of the Sanhedrin, and the other is called the Abed Din, which would be the head of the Sanhedrin. In total, there were 5 pairs, and the last one is Hillel and Shammai. So it's just Shammai as the leader at the time when Jesus is teaching. So it makes sense. It's like you have Paul trained by Gamaliel, but then you also have, he's from Tarsus, which has its own mixture of Stoic stuff and other Greek philosophy. But then when you start to tie it all in historically, not only is Paul connected to Jesus' teachings, because Jesus is in a lot of ways like Hillel, but different, wholly different.
Yeah, I would say Jesus, from a traditional perspective, is more. He's basically a Pharisee. You look at the other schools of thought running around.
Yeah.
Israel at the time.
Yeah.
He's not a Sadducee. He's not a zealot. He's not an Essene. Right, yeah. You run through these schools of thought, and what you land on is Jesus is far because the Pharisees are again, they're basically like and Paul calls himself a Pharisee. Mm-hmm. The Pharisees are, again, they're the biblical fundamentalists. They're the ones who take the Bible, literally and really try to live it out.
I'm actually working on a script that maybe we'll get out on our channel at some point around all of things that were going on historically at the time. And I find it super interesting that Jesus is pushing back on that, because when you look at the fact that Hillel had died maybe 20 years prior to Jesus' ministry, there is a power void for the first time, because the pairs, this was the last time. There had been 5 sets of pairs that had
in the Sanhedrin.
And this is the first time there was not a equally balanced pair, and they were the last one, Hillel and Shammai. And so then you have this kind of like power void going on, and Jesus is basically speaking into that. And I find it super interesting. And I kind of just brought this up because of Paul, because Jesus is kind of, to me, he comes across the way that the law is taught, let's just say, the way that he's teaching of the law is similar to the way that Hillel was doing it. Hillel did the first golden rule. He had his own version.
Well, yeah, it's not exactly the same.
It's not the same.
A different formulation.
Yeah,
Jesus pushes it farther.
Jesus turns it.
Well, Jesus
the first positive golden rule.
Yeah, that's right. Jesus. I think Hillel. I mean, I'm off the top of my head right here, but I think Hillel's was almost like, don't do to others things you would not want done to yourself.
Right.
Whereas Jesus, so it's like, don't punch people in the face, because you want to get punched in the face. Well, that's true enough. You probably shouldn't do that. But yeah, Jesus pushes it farther because he gives us the responsibility to initiate kindness. Mm-hmm. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. which is it's
a
that's
positive,
completely different. And it pushes it so much farther because now I have the responsibility to initiate kindness.
It's the Good Samaritan, right?
You have to go insanity, but but be what you would want the other person to be in a given relationship.
Mm-hmm.
That's not always easy, because sometimes, like when I was a school administrator, there would be conflicts, because it was like, well, if I was this kid, I'd want, mercy and grace. But if I was the parents of all the other kids in this classroom, I'd want him thrown out of school,
Yeah.
Because what I'm saying? So sometimes there's like a balancing act, and it takes wisdom to figure out how to really walk that out,
mm-hmm.
Because how different people would want to be treated sort of comes into conflict sometimes.
Yeah.
It takes a lot of wisdom to walk it out. But there's this thing hung up, which I do think Jesus pushes beyond, which is why I'm a little bit slow to say, yeah, Jesus was just like, Gamilel. I'm like,
But so I guess my point that I was gonna make, it's like, you see Gamilel, the only real reference you see to Gamilel is when in Acts, when they're like, kill him, like Peter and John.
And he's like, if it's a God thing, it'll work out. If it's not, it won't.
Like, maybe we shouldn't, because what if it's true?
Yeah.
So I think that's interesting that he's speaking up there, because he would have been the one member taking over as the president, or as the whatever the two were. I can't remember right now.
Well,
you probably know better than me.
Bring it back to kind of Paul.
Yeah, that's my whole point.
And
let's get to Paul.
Paul was well prepared.
Right.
That God spent a lifetime preparing Paul to be this perfectly formed tool that could speak to Jews and they would understand the Jewish background, but could also speak to Greeks and Romans, because he did have that upbringing. He had that knowledge. He had that kind of preparation, which is why he can have an encounter with Jesus on the road to Damascus. And as we kind of talked about in other episodes, like, Jesus didn't have to do a full download of a life full of information for Paul. Paul already had all this information, all his teaching, all his knowledge. And all he had to do was just adjust it. We believe this and this and this and this and this, and Jesus is the Messiah. Paul didn't have necessarily this huge worldview change when he had his revelation of Christ. He just, it is a worldview change, but it's maybe not as radical as would have been for some other kind of people. It just was an adjustment of his previous worldview. Oh, all of this in light of Jesus now, So yeah, in that, being trained by Gamilel does fit into that, because he knows both. I think is sort of at the end of all that discussion, is he's very, very well versed in both things.
Yeah, that was kind of like my point. I think it's really interesting when you just look at the history of it, and you start to connect them to real people, and you're like, this is what this real person taught, and we know what Jesus taught, and then we know who Gamilel is, but we don't know that much. But then when you start to look at the history, and then you look at what Paul then taught, and then what did it mean for him to be a Jew of Jews, and then what did it mean for him?
Yeah, and I think to your point, that's true. And Paul did come from a school of Judaism that was more easily synthesized with the teachings of Christ than others.
Yeah.
So had Paul come from like the Sadducees, I don't even believe in the afterlife, I don't believe in eternity, there's no resurrection, that's a far bigger leap.
Right.
Yeah. So I think there is truth in that he came from the right school of Judaism to more easily change lanes, into becoming a Christ follower. So I think that is true.
And his training in the Greek thought and all that stuff also is what propelled the New Testament, his writings, forward, and it's why we have the culture we have today. So it's really fascinating. So
there's a lot of cross-cultural pollination going on between Judaism and the Greek world for a long time. Some of the archaeological record is really almost strange. If you go up in the Galilee, because Judea, where Jerusalem and Hebron are, was very, very homogeneously Jewish, but the Galilee was really mixed. And so you go in the Galilee and you start digging around, and what you see are synagogues with mosaics of the zodiac on the floor. And you're like, what on earth? This has no business here.
Yeah.
And a big giant zodiac on the floor of a synagogue, you're like, that doesn't belong here. There should be no image of an animal or a human in here, much less that one. Oh, but here it is, but we do this, right? We bring stuff into our churches and we're like, oh, it's harmless, just from the culture. It's not really a big thing. So yes, there was that cross-pollination going on. And Paul, as a Greek Jew, is a super example of that. Thanks for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, click like and subscribe. It really helps us. And if you really enjoyed it, go on over to our website, thelandinthebible.com, and become a supporter. It helps us generate more content and gives you access to our full library of video and Bible study content.